Hi everyone and welcome to Module 4. We're halfway through the course, so congratulations, we're at least halfway there. In this module we're going to look at qualitative research, and in the next module we'll examine quantitative research. You'll recall we talked about both of these in Module 3, where Guba and Lincoln discussed 4 major paradigmatic streams that fit under these two overarching research approaches. I confess that I'm much more comfortable with this module, as my research has primarily used various qualitative approaches to research, including critical, feminist, interpretive, phenomenological, and so on. I was one of those students who dropped math as soon as she could until university when I had to take it, and found I actually quite enjoyed it again, but I never did take a statistics course, so my background for quantitative research isn't as broad as some of you will have. Nevertheless, let's look at qualitative research this week. Your readings this week are 3 chapters from Marshall, Rossman, and Blanco, in which they discuss qualitative research and its possibilities, including a vast array, and you'll be interested in how vast it is, of research approaches within the dominant paradigms of educational research. There are also 2 excellent videos that provide real-life examples of researchers doing research. The Phoenix and Silverwood videos, both of them, give excellent examples of qualitative studies and the considerations that each of these researchers had to think about in using these forms of research. The news for the assignments is a good one this week because you actually only have one assignment during the module, and that's the forum discussion. You may, however, wish to begin to prep for the next assignment in Module 5. I'll be posting a video that explores both the assignment for Module 5 and 6 so that you can begin during this module, wrapping your head around them and perhaps beginning to do some early prep. Or you may see a bit of a rest as more important at this point, and I would certainly understand that too, given the circumstances that we've been dealing with this year especially. I'm going to, in this video, I'm going to kind of take a different tack than just than talking about the content of the readings and the videos and extending them a little bit. Rather, what I'm going to do is talk about the specifics. I thought it would be helpful to lay out a kind of theoretical map that can help situate the primary approaches to research that we've been talking about. Positivism, post-positivism, interpretivism / constructivism, and critical theory. And there are others that these tend to be found, but these tend to be foundational to understanding discussions about the paradigms that form the roots for all of the approaches that Marshall, Rossman, and Blanco discuss. But 2 caveats before I begin. Some of you may have an extensive sociology or political science or philosophical background already, and what I'm going to discuss may be old hat to you, so I apologize for that. Second, every slide I show could turn into a whole course, so what I am sharing is very much a sort of aerial view rather than a deep, up close look. If you think of what I'm going to be presenting as kind of like a map, that would likely be most accurate. So let's begin there. So I'm going to be talking to each of these slides, and the first one that I chose to have a look at is structural functionalism, because structural functionalism has been an approach to thinking about the world in which we live, the organizations that are a part of that world, and so on, really since the beginning of modern times. It's informed how people's worldviews have emerged. Structural functionalism is a framework for building theory that sees society as a complex system. It's sort of like a body. So if you think of the body as a metaphor for the complex systems that are part of society, all of the parts have to work together, and they do that to promote solidarity and stability. If one part starts to go awry, then we have problems, and certainly during COVID we found that out very, very quickly. The whole structure of society is interconnected and accountable for maintaining the equilibrium that's necessary for the body or the social structures to maintain themselves, and to maintain themselves in a situation of kind of peace and tranquility the status quo, you could say. Deviation from that norm then leads to disruption of the social order. So we have this kind of desire of social theory and research about social institutions to bring order, to bring equilibrium to the body that is being looked at. And one of the first, and certainly not the only, but one of perhaps the most well-known theorists to do just that is Emile Durkheim, who was a sociologist who tried to understand the social world in which we live. And he did some really important work. And probably if you took a sociology course, you learned about Emile Durkheim and some of his theories. And one of the things he said, and I'm trying to, in each case, relate this to education, one of the things he said was that society can survive only if there exists among its members a sufficient degree of homogeneity. Education perpetuates and reinforces this homogeneity by fixing in the mind of the child from the beginning the essential similarities that social life demands. So look at those words, homogeneity, similarities, fixing in the mind, the essential similarities, in fact. And we see the connection here between what he's doing when he's doing his sociology research to a structural functionalist view of the world. Another thing that he said was that sociological method, as we practice it, rests wholly on the basic principle that social facts must be studied as things, that is, as realities external to the individual. And you may remember this as being very much in the positivist domain. So when you think back to Goodbye Lincoln, you see Emile Durkheim fitting very well into that positivist framework. But while he was doing his work, there were changes in the world that were happening. So in the late 10s of the 1900s into the 20s and 30s, we have the First World War and the effects of the First World War. And what that did was start to call into question that notion of the world as a place that was one of kind of peaceful harmony, that we had some kind of power to call that into being, so to speak, through the social theories that we used to understand the world in which we lived. And what came of that then is a move to both constructivism and critical theory. So let's look at constructivism first. And here we have Jean Piaget and also John Dewey, both of whom I'm sure you've heard a lot about at your education courses and so on, who began to think about the experience of children coming to know the world in which they live through the relationships that they have, through the experiences that they have, and so on. Rather than seeing reality as out there, it was something that was experienced by them. It was experienced, in Piaget's case, children putting a block into a pool of water and beginning to understand notions of volume, for example, that sort of thing. How can we compare then these notions of positivism and interpretivism, constructivism? And by the way, I'll send these charts to you so we don't have to spend a huge amount of time on them, but just to compare a little bit. So let's take 2 or 3 categories. First of all, in terms of the ontology, in positivism, the person and the researcher and reality are separate. They have to be separate in order for what's being studied to be able to be studied objectively. So the researcher has to be separate from the object being studied. In interpretivism, the person or the researcher and reality are in fact inseparable. So the researcher brings their experience to the question being asked, and while they may kind of bracket that experience, nevertheless they recognize that as a part of how they come to understand how someone else comes to understand that same phenomenon. So there's this coming together of understandings. In epistemology, The objective reality exists beyond the human mind in positivism. It's outside again of the person. Knowledge exists outside of. It is separate from the knower and the knowledge are separate from one another. Knowledge of the world in interpretivism is intentionally constituted through a person's lived experience. So it's very much emic. So we have etic and emic being demonstrated here. I think theories of truth are interesting as well, because under positivism, correspondence theory of truth is one-to-one mapping between research statements and reality. So if the research says it is so, it is so. That is how truth is arrived at. It is arrived at through objective investigation, so that we can make a judgment about whether something is truth or not, reality or not. In the case of interpretivism, truth as intentional is seen as intentional fulfillment. Interpretations of the research object match the lived experience of the object, so they're very much married to one another, so to speak. So, you know, I would ask you to kind of have a look at these charts, because I think they're helpful in just thinking about where we're situated when we're doing our research, when we make the kinds of choices that we make. None of them are wrong, but they do get us to different places. And we start in different places as well. Critical theory is quite interesting, because here we see the Frankfurt School, which was a part of one of the large universities in Frankfurt, Germany. And this was a school that was looking at critical theory as expressed by Marx and expressed by Kant and others. There had been a long history, actually, of people, you know, thinking critically about the world in which we live. But it had never been a kind of predominant way of thinking about the world. However, just like Piaget and Dewey, these scholars in Germany had gone through the whole imposition of the Nazi fascism. They had seen the society disintegrate into very disparate factions where there was no center. The center did not hold, as the poem says. So we have the right and the left, and they were separate realities. They had nothing to say to one another. And the right prevailed, and the left was dominated. And so this was a time of great turmoil. Many of the philosophers and sociologists and musicologists and you name it that were scholars in the Frankfurt School were also Jewish. And so there was a whole other layer of understanding of what was going on in the world. And so they felt that they had to come to a different way of thinking about the world that we occupied, and that it needed to begin with the notion that instead of the world coming together as an entity, as a kind of organism, in fact, the world was a much more contentious place, and there was a great deal of conflict in the world, and we needed to be able to think about that much more realistically and much more creatively in order for us to not to return to equilibrium, but to a fight against oppression and that sort of thing. And so the critical theorist then, who had roots right back to Kant in the 18th century, actually moved first to England and then to New York, and established the New School of Social Research affiliated with the university there, and used some of Marx's early critical theories, as well as Hegel's and psychoanalysis, Freud, and so on, to rethink how we understood the world and rethink how we can make change in the world so that these terrible things that they had witnessed didn't happen again. So critical theory then is a way to examine and critique society and culture. So this was very much around looking at cultural entities as well, music, theater, all aspects of the arts, because the arts had been used to impose a Nazi sensibility. So there was a critique of the arts as well as part of this. They were interested in radical change, the radical change of oppression as a result of the dominant forms of power, institutions like education and so on, and cultural expression under capitalism. And this is very much not an anti-capitalism, but a critique of capitalism to those that encourage social justice. Their main aim, and this is the bottom line, and this is the important one, is social transformation and emancipation through critique. So when, sometimes we look at what research has been done and we say, but all they're doing is critiquing, they would argue that the critique itself is what allows us to open ourselves to new realities and to envision a better world. So they also rethought the role of schooling within capitalism. And there were some interesting and some highly critiqued, actually, positions that were taken. So, for example, Michel Foucault, who himself would not have called himself a critical theorist, but, was very much so in much of what he did, was actually looking at how prisons and mental institutions actually operate. How is it that they manage the people that are part of that population? And how can we understand what it is that happens in these institutions? So he used the model of, Bentham's the model of prisons. And Bentham was I don't know what you call him, I guess kind of a sociologist, philosopher, who years and years before had come up with a model of the ideal of a prison. And this ideal was a tower in the middle with a person who occupied the top part of the tower so that they could see all around, and they had windows all around the tower where they were. So they had a 360-degree view. And they could be looking in any direction at any time, but they couldn't be seen. So, so the prisoners who occupied the prison that was a building that encircled the tower, and in one kind of layer of cells with a window on each of the cells that looked out to the tower, it meant that the person in the tower could see the prisoners, but the prisoners couldn't see the person in the tower. So they never knew when they were being surveilled. So Foucault argued that in society, we operate very much that way. We operate in a way, we are a surveillance society. And that is how people are controlled. And that is how people are regulated. And so he argued that schools serve the same kind of social function because both prisons and mental institutions define, classify, control, and regulate people through surveillance. So what does he mean? So, for example, if we were to think about Amazon. So Amazon has ways of surveilling how long it takes each person to do each minute part of their job. And they know exactly how long they think. They know exactly how long it should take. And if they take longer, they can get in trouble. If they take a bathroom break, they can get in trouble, that sort of thing. So every movement is surveilled. Even the people that, I was shocked to learn this the other day, even the people that are delivering your packages, they're surveilled as well. So they have to clock in and clock out for all of their deliveries. And they have to ensure that, that they do it within the time parameters that are set for them, or they can get fired. So this is how they're surveilled. Now, we may not think that we do that in schools, but we do it through marks. We do it through watching as kids go up and down the halls. We do it through surveillance out in the yard. And that's partly for safety, but it's also partly to make sure that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? So sometimes surveillance isn't a bad thing. It may be a good thing in some cases, but that is how we control and that is how we regulate. And we do that for a particular kind of purpose. But it's a very interesting notion of how we can think about what actually is happening in schooling. It's a bit of a dark view, but it's nevertheless one that could be well supported. Bowles and Gintis, who were sociologists, came up with what they called the correspondence principle. What they suggested was that that each aspect of schooling is actually preparing students for the workplace. So our practices mirror what is expected in the workplace. So there's a hierarchy of authority, for example, in schools, to match the hierarchy of authority in the workplace. So students become used to that. They're motivated by marks and by various strategies that we use in school, because those are the same kind of strategies that will be used in the workplace, and so on. Now, and they argued not only this, but they also argued that when working class kids come into schools, they are prepared to go to working class jobs in the workplace. Middle class kids are prepared to go to middle class jobs in the workplace, and wealthy kids are prepared to go to a workplace that reflects the kind of wealth that they have. So it's, so what they were critiqued for was the lack of agency, that children coming in have no agency. It was really kind of like a sausage machine. You put the child in, and out will pop the worker who will be prepared for the place that child is meant to occupy. And of course, that's not fully how it happens. Is it in some ways how it happens? Yes, it is. So it's an interesting way of thinking about it, but it's a dark way, and it's one that doesn't reflect everything that happens in schools. And so there was a significant critique. One of those who took a different tack was Paulo Freire, who famously said, education does not change the world, education changes people, and people change the world. So he used what he called, and I could never say this word, conscientization, or critical consciousness. That's what he saw education as being, to raise critical consciousness so that students, and he was teaching very poor students in South America, to recognize not only the place that they held, but why they were in that place and what kinds of forces were, dominant forces were keeping them there. So in recognizing those oppressive social forces that were shaping society and shaping their place in society, they could take action against those forces for the purpose of a more equitable society. So that provided a more hopeful result for education using a critical perspective. Another would be Bell Hooks, who recently died and left a wonderful legacy of very hopeful and very critical analysis of what goes on in schools. And I would recommend everybody read Teaching to Transgress. It's a wonderful book. If you haven't read it already, it's very accessible, very critical, and very hopeful. And she says, I entered the classroom with the conviction that it was crucial for me and every other student to be an active participant, not a passive consumer. Education is the practice of freedom. Education that connects the will to know with the will to become. Learning is a place where paradise can be created. And each of these authors is thinking about that as creating citizens who are active, critical citizens within democratic societies that can find an equitable place in that society, and not be held down because of dominant capitalist forces, for example. So lastly, I have a chart here that compares critical theory versus constructivism. And I think it's interesting to look at just the slight differences, but significant differences between them. So while critical theory is a social theory that describes and analyzes society and social norms, typically with the aim of enhancing the freedom of the individual while preserving social justice, constructivism is a theory that states humans construct knowledge through their intelligence, experiences, and interactions with the world. So what's missing really from this description is this part about typically with the aim. So the aim may be that, but it may be something else. So it's not built into constructivism. Uses a realist ontology. There is such a thing as an external reality. A critical theorist believes that not everything is constructed, that some things are real and people feel real pain and etc. Whereas constructivists believe that everything is constructed reality. And, so we could go back and forth on that. That's an interesting difference. And the main aim is social transformation and emancipation through critique in its critical theory. And under constructivism, the main aim is exploring the concept of reality and knowledge. So I've taken up enough of your time. I know this has been a quick kind of run through this kind of theoretical map, but I hope it's helpful to you in kind of locating yourself where your theoretical perspective is located, and how it is that that's going to affect the kind of research that you're going to be doing, and where your question eventually that you develop will fit in terms of finding the best response to that question. So I hope that this is helpful. If you have any questions about anything I've said or anything that you think needs to be added and people need to know, I'd really like to hear from you. So all the best, and I wish you luck in Module 4, sorry. I'm getting out of myself. Take care.